Hello everyone, good afternoon to all our participants in Malaysia and the region, and good morning to our participants in the UK. I hope everybody is keeping safe and managing well. I am Jazrin Harith, Trade Officer at the British Malaysian Chamber of Commerce, Berhad. Welcome to the second day of Malaysia Climate Action Week, co-organized by the British High Commission Kuala Lumpur and the BMCC, with the theme Race to Zero, Keeping Up the Momentum. Before we move on to the forum, we will now be playing a short corporate video and then followed by a message video by our climate action partner, DDGI Limited, Stella Cox, the Managing Director.
DDCAT Group is a proud sponsor of Malaysia Climate Action Week and a committed supporter of the British Malaysian Chamber of Commerce. The BMCC leads important work in promoting the inclusion of ESG considerations into corporate strategies through workable solutions and in championing the race to net zero across Malaysia. We at DDCAT stand by these initiatives. We believe that net zero commitments are vital to meeting the targets set by the Paris Agreement and to addressing the imminent climate emergency as set out recently in the IPCC report. We strongly endorse the BMCC's thought leadership on best practices to ensure that net zero commitments are truly net zero. As an SME in the financial services industry, we recognise the effort in committing to net zero. We number amongst the many organisations worldwide currently responding to the challenges of accurately measuring their carbon footprint, particularly those emissions that are classified as Scope 3. We're committed to working collaboratively with our fellow members of the financial services community to find ways to better understand and measure the environmental impact of our sector so that we may address it appropriately and swiftly. We applaud the work of large institutions in their net zero declarations, but MSMEs are the backbone of Malaysia's economy, and we call them to action now by joining with us in taking steps to initiate similar commitments. Individually, those commitments may seem small and even insignificant, but the potential impact from collective change is huge. Like all journeys, this one will also be embarked upon with small steps. These commitments must be made honestly and transparently. They must be supported by legitimate data, which is underpinned by strong governance. Only within these parameters will our commitment to net zero make a difference. We believe that the work of the BMCC will bring us closer to that goal, and we stand ready to support the BMCC in that endeavour. Malaysia Climate Action Week provides us with the opportunity to create partnerships to address these matters. So over the next 5 days, we look forward to engaging with other industry leaders as we all prepare for COP26 and thereafter to tackle the work that is yet to come. By collaborating together across sectors and industries, we can keep up the momentum and effect positive change for people and for planet.
Before moving on to the forum session, a few rules and regulations before we begin our session. Please ask questions during the session and send them to the Q&A chat feature at the bottom of your screen. We will attempt to address your questions during the Q&A session if time permits. In this forum session, the panelists will be addressing on how climate governance is shaping corporations today. I will give a quick overview of the panelists today. First, we have Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar. He is currently the chairman of Bursa Malaysia Berhad. Tan Sri is regarded as one of the most versatile corporate leaders in Malaysia, having successfully led 4 major organizations in infrastructure development, telecommunications, financial services, and investment management. Tan Sri served as Group Chairman of Permodalan Nasional Berhad, PNB, Malaysia's largest fund management company, from August 2016 to June 2018, following completion of his term as a senator and minister in the Prime Minister's Department in charge of economic planning from June 2013 to June 2016. Our next panelist is Ms. Arina Koch. She's a partner in Ernst & Young Consulting Srian Berhad and the EY ASEAN Integrated Reporting Subject Matter Expert. Ms. Arina assists clients to integrate sustainability into long-term strategic and operational plans to create lasting value, enhance reputation, and build public trust. Ms. Arina's experience is primarily in sustainability consulting, ESG strategy, due diligence, framework development, outcome measurement, and stakeholder management. Our third panelist is Mr. Ralph Dixon. Ralph Dixon is the Director of Environmental Investments at YTL Corporation Berhad. The group's core businesses are ownership and management of regulated utilities and other infrastructure assets, serving more than 12 million customers on 3 continents. Ralph has been with YTL for more than 14 years, managing the environmental investment and sustainability divisions for the group. Ralph is also CEO of their carbon consulting subsidiary, which is YTL SV Carbon. Our fourth panelist is Mr. Yi. He was appointed as President and Group Chief Executive Officer of MISC Group on 1st January 2015. Mr. Yi is also a Director of the Members Committee of the United Kingdom Mutual Steamship Assurance Association, Bermuda Limited, UK P&I Club, and he is also an Advisory Council member of Global Maritime Forum. Mr. Yi is also on the National Shipping and Ports Council for Malaysia, the International Advisory Panel for the Maritime Decarbonization, and a member of the Advisory Board of Lloyd's Register. We are pleased to have Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, founder of the Climate Governance Malaysia, CGM, to moderate this session. A quick background on Datin Sri Sunita before I hand it over to her. Datin Sri Sunita founded Climate Governance Malaysia, which is the country chapter of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance Initiative, a fellow of Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia. She is also a member of Global Advisory Board of Nottingham University's School of Business, the advisory panel of the UN Global Compact Malaysia Sustainability Center of Excellence. Datin Sri Sunita also supports the CEO Action Network, an industry-led initiative to increase sustainability and climate resilience. and promotes gender diversity on boards with the 30% club. Without further ado, Datin Sri Sunita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jazreen. Welcome, everyone. And thank you especially to the British Malaysian Chamber of Commerce and the British High Commission for organizing this exciting Malaysia Climate Action Week. As DDCAP Group just mentioned, we need honest and transparent commitments underpinned by strong data. Today, we will be discussing how climate governance is shaping corporations today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to share with us. So to start off, I would like to invite Tan Sri Wahid. Bursa's actions have been sending a strong signal to the capital markets. Notably, FTSE for Good was launched a full year prior to the Paris Accord in December 2015. They have been promoting the TCFD framework for years. And of course, the very impressive declaration of ambition of a net zero target, which was made on 22nd September. How is Bursa incorporating climate governance principles as a standing item in the board's agenda and working towards increasing the climate resilience of other listed companies via the governance of climate risks? Tan Sri Wahid.
Well, thank you, Datin Sri Sunita. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good afternoon. Thank you, Datin Sri, and thank you, BMCC, for inviting me alongside distinguished professionals in sustainability. So I feel honored to be alongside all of you. Now, if I may, Datin Sri, please allow me to answer your questions, perhaps in three parts. I think firstly, I'd like to talk a bit about the latest climate change developments. And secondly, the case for corporates in embracing ESG and how we as an exchange are influencing business practices and lead the transition towards a net zero economy. And third, how do we improve the governance of climate-related risk of public listed companies? Now, firstly, on the report, so 2 months ago in August, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced their 6th assessment report that highlighted changes in climate that have been observed in every region and across the whole climate system. So many of the changes are unprecedented and some are irreversible over hundreds to thousands of years. And as the report made it clear, global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade or even 2 degrees centigrade will be exceeded this century unless we make very deep cuts to our carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades. And the IPCC findings are certainly worrying, but to me, all hope is not lost. I think there's still possible for the Earth to keep below 1.5 degrees centigrade global warming for this century if we rapidly cut our emissions to net zero. Now, there's also the Science-Based Targets Initiative, where over 900 companies representing more than $13 trillion in terms of market cap have responded to the open letter from global leaders, and they've signed the business ambition for 1.5 degrees commitment. And the business ambition for 1.5 degrees commitment is an urgent call to action from a global coalition of UN agencies, business and industry leaders in partnership with Race to Zero. Now, on our part here in Malaysia, we are indeed very pleased that the Malaysian government has announced our aspiration to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions as early as 2050 and to reduce the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions across the economy by 45% in 2030. Now, this intensity reduction was made unconditionally, and it is 10% higher than the earlier target. Now, obviously, to me, the transition towards net zero economy will require a comprehensive approach, combining carbon pricing mechanism with green infrastructure investments and supportive macroeconomic policies. And that brings me to the second part, into the case for corporates to embrace ESG and how we as an exchange are influencing business practices and lead the transition towards a net zero economy. Now, to me, the case for businesses to embrace ESG, including the environmental part of it, in our strategy and operations is clear. Now, as you know, today we have more than 4,000 fund managers and asset owners who are signatories to the UN principles for responsible investment. So I'm happy to note that DDCAP is actually one of the signatories. Then you have the major global banks which have signed the UN principles for responsible banking, and more recently you have the global insurance companies that have signed the UN principles for sustainable insurance. So what this means is that businesses that ignore ESG will not be sustainable, as they will not be able to secure both equity and debt funding to fund their projects. They will not be able to secure underwriters to secure or underwrite their projects, or they have to pay huge premium for it. They will have difficulties to find the human capital talent necessary to drive their business, and they will also find difficulties in selling the products, because consumers nowadays, they are more discerning, and they will only buy products that are sustainably produced. And naturally, if you're not sustainable, you cannot be part of any global supply chain, because every single player would demand all players to be sustainable in their approach. Now, obviously, as an exchange, we are in a unique position to influence business practices and lead the transition towards a net zero economy. And we aim to do this through active engagement and educational efforts to influence our public listed companies to aggressively reduce their emissions and to even adopt net zero ambitions. And in this respect, let me perhaps share some measures to ensure credible and net zero claims. I think first is through strong disclosures on climate achievements. And this is where companies are required to provide adequate information regarding their carbon footprint from their own operations and value chains. And it's important for them to consistently communicate data, clear frameworks and timelines in a comparable way to track progress towards their reduction targets. Secondly, through clear science-based emission reduction targets to ensure emission reductions which are in line with climate science and decarbonization required to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius reduction. And companies must be guided by science in setting their targets, and that's the only way we can achieve the required reductions. And third is to have an accountability on climate goals and achievements from the top, that is the board. It should not be just a management or operational issue. The tone must be set at the top. The board must demonstrate a strong stewardship in managing the company's climate-related risks and opportunities. And next, we need to ensure programs and plans contribute towards decarbonization of business activities and develop a sensible offsetting approach. Companies, of course, should focus on reducing their own intensities before they start to think about leveraging on carbon credits or offsets. And finally, companies should analyze the transition risk on their business model as net zero emissions becomes a new norm of new business. Now, having said that, let me perhaps deal specifically with our own internal climate action practices. Now, as an advocate of strong climate action, we recognize that we have an obligation to actively manage our own carbon footprint and climate-related impacts. I'm pleased to share that our climate governance principles are very much aligned with the World Economic Forum's climate governance initiatives, the 8 guiding principles. But given the time constraints, I will skip that and move to the third part of my comments, which is how do we improve the governance of climate-related risks of public listed companies? Now, there are, to me, 3 major ways, if I may the 3. The first is through advocacy programs on climate change that cover elements of climate governance. We at Bursa Malaysia have conducted several climate change advocacy programs in recent years, including workshop on the TCFD recommendations, of which climate governance is one of the core components. Secondly, via development of TCFD application guide through the GC3 platform. So this is the Joint Committee on Climate Change platform, where Bursa Malaysia is currently coordinating and contributing to the development of a TCFD application guide for Malaysian financial institutions, including some of our own listed issuers, such as Maybank and CIMB. The development of the guide has been delegated to a subcommittee on disclosure and governance, which is chaired by Bursa. And the application guide contains recommendations on climate governance that are tailored to the mission context. And last but not least, through the curated climate-related articles and content pieces on our portal Bursa Sustain. Now, we at Bursa Malaysia, we have curated a number of articles on climate change and climate governance for the benefit of our listed issuers since 2018, and some of which would include Carbon Footprinting 101, a guide for mission business for positive climate action, and navigating the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, or TCFD, a roadmap for action. So I would strongly encourage all of you to make a full use of these freely available resources to help you understand more on sustainability topic, practices, and others relating to sustainability. So let me perhaps stop here, Dr. Sri. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tan Sri Wahid. Very comprehensive and showed very clearly exactly what Bursa has been doing for so long as well. Now I'd like to invite the lady on the panel, Ernst & Young, Arena Corp partner. Bursa and other capital market prudential regulators have been talking about sustainability for years, but there are challenges on the ground. So what are these challenges that you have personally observed in getting boards of directors, management teams to understand the implications of this existential risk and the personal liabilities that could arise out of this? Why are they having difficulty fully comprehending this? Over to you, Arena.
Thank you, Datin Sri, and thank you, BHCC, for the invite. So getting into the discussion, I think we have been since Bursa has launched the sustainability regulations requirements, we have 900 listed companies who have got on the bandwagon to report on their sustainability reporting. Now, I think what I wanted to share was what happens behind the scene within the organizations at the senior management level. Now, over the past 6 years, we have seen different organizations mature at a different pace. We see 3 different categories. So I'll talk about the 3 different categories. The first category is essentially the leader. For the leader who are in the various sector, they understand the importance and the impact to survivability and capital funding. Now, a lot of these key players have gone through a number of controversies, especially in the plantation sector or in the energy sector. What they have moved is they start to have their sustainability framework. They are moving from reporting to targets and sustainability performance evaluation. Quite a number of them have also started to adopt the 5 best practices of the MCCG 2021 Malaysia Code of Corporate Governance Guidelines, which just came out in April this year. There is a clear line of sight of ESG priorities for those who are in the leading, because there is a sustainability committee typically set up, which supports the CEO and facilitation to the board. Now, when we see those who are in the leading category, the CEO, Chief Strategy Officer, Chief Risk Officer, and Chief Operating Officer have a clear line of sight of where the roadmap are. And typically, this leader would have a year step-up program or a roadmap to advance sustainability year on year. They may not have a clear jump, but this is the, I would say, the attribute of the leading organization. Now, second tier is the follower. For the follower category, the C-suites are very task-centric. Typically, they operate in silo and very function-focused. So the clear challenge is they do have a number of ESG policies, but unclear KPIs and targets to drive progress. Typically, this follower category have not started measuring emissions, does not have human rights policies, or even supply chain management or audits. These are the clear follower category. Where we see are the laggards Now, the laggards come from the last year of maturity. And I would say that, these are the area that we got to highlight. The laggards category are those that treats this as a checkbox exercise, lip service, or very much still having the corporate CSR, corporate social responsibility mentality. There is no clear outcome of their CSR. And they are typically led by the corporate communication rather than the strategy and risk. There is no clear prioritization of ESG matters or ESG metrics in their report. And where we have seen our controversies have affected their branding with, US sanctions and some examples of where they had to be reactive on some of these allegations. So these are the laggards. One thing I want to highlight is, given the last 6 years, we've seen a lot of significant drive by investors as well as regulations that have reached to the board level. So a lot of board levels now are very much aware, given even under the COVID pandemic situation, a lot of board members have regularly engaged on ESG and they're very much on board. Now, the key challenge, what we're seeing, is the C-suite management and the senior management. The gap is very clear in terms of how do they align with the board direction. And one of the key challenges, because for C-suite, quite a number of them are on 5-year contract or even shorter. So naturally, they are very much profit driven. And unless the board and the senior management have a very clear short, medium, and long-term KPIs tied into their remuneration performance, typically there would be a certain impact on how they drive ESG within the organization. So one thing I wanted to highlight is it is quite clear that the board starts to get the understanding and buy-in, but the alignment of strategies, performance, and target with the senior management are the critical discussion at the board and senior management level that needs to happen. The only way to move the needle clearly for all these organizations is when we would see how they would respond to the MCCG this coming year, right? They have to outline who's going to drive ESG, how do they review performance, how does the board oversee, whether it's the main board approving strategy, the risk at the board committee look at the risk, as well as the nomination and remuneration committee will evaluate ESG performance, how they are remunerated. Now, if all these comes into clear adoption by all companies, I think we can see a clear needle being moved. One thing I wanted to highlight last but not least is investors are really coming very hard on this. We have been, EY, we've been working with Bank Negara and Securities Commission JC3 for the past 2 years. We've helped Bank Negara and JC3 to roll out 6 capability workshops on climate risk, as well as the JC3 flagship conference event earlier this year. There will be further workshops coming up in the coming months. And all these only points to one area. The financial institutions, the banks, the insurers, asset managers are going to instill more stringent ESG assessment, including climate risk, into their lending activities, insurance activities, and how they are going to drive investments strategically moving forward. So we have already engaged with the rest of the CEOs, those, what the banks and the insurance are coming for. Even for the sectorial guides on plantation, renewable energy, and energy efficiency, when we brought the value-based intermediation sectorial guides to the likes of the plantation, palm oil plantation CEOs, I think they are getting a step back and say, okay, these are the metrics, the banks are going to come after you. So you can actually see that, all the CEOs are taking a sit up, because everyone is going to ask for this. And if you're not ready within the next 6 months to a year, you will see a lot of these questions become more of an expectation rather than a nice to have. So with that, Datin, I'll hand back to you.
Excellent, Arina. I expected no less, but a great overview. Thank you so much. And thank you, of course, for all your hard work that you've been doing on the JC3 as well. And so now over to YTL, Ralph Dixon. So everything we do is extractive of the environment, but it is arguable that the construction sector must be one of the most damaging and directly leads to the loss of biodiversity. Of course, YTL is a thought leader in this space. Could you please share with us examples demonstrating how the principles of climate governance are discussed at every board meeting, including efforts to measure the reduction of negative impacts? Over to you, Ralph.
So much, Datin Sri. I thought when you asked this question, it was a very good one, and obviously we had time to prepare. So I won't bore you with too many slides, but just, I thought it would be easier for me to present a little bit about how we pose our climate governance in terms of our sustainability governance structure, and how that then cascades down and also goes up into the board level, which is, I think, what you were pertaining to. Obviously, cement is a very interesting topic and a very good question, because it's probably the concrete is the second largest material used after water globally, and represents around 8% of global emissions. The other interesting thing about concrete is that it's a multi-stakeholder issue in terms of the different impacts that the actual product it has on the environment and on communities as well. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble. There we go. So our governance structure is very important in this regard, because it represents a way we deal with the climate governance issues. And I think what you'll find is that with the cement issue or concrete issue, it's very much an industry issue rather than a company issue. So we engage with various associations globally and tackle it on that basis, as well as a company. Now, I'm not going to run you through the entire cement making process, but as you can see, it not only involves a lot of moving parts, a lot of different areas, but also a lot of, as I said, different stakeholders. So that's why it's critical that we engage all the different stakeholders and ensure that proper communication channels are established for supply chain issues, as well as internal communication issues. And obviously involved with this is biodiversity conservation, environmental community issues as well. Malayan Cement, as you know, YTL Cement acquired Lafarge Cement Malaysia, and we became then Malayan Cement Berhad. Various different focus areas. So it's not only on decarbonization of the actual operations themselves, but also for finding other areas in which to mitigate emissions and move towards the target of carbon neutral by 2050. It's unfortunately cement very hard to abate, because you've got a chemical reaction in the calcination process, which accounts for around 60% of the emissions of cement making. So you can only really deal effectively with reducing the production of Portland cement, and obviously reducing the emissions on alternative fuels, aggregates, etc. That's why we involve so many different stakeholders in terms of the non-recyclable, the co-processing of incinerator bottom ash, industrial waste, etc. Trying to cover all those different stakeholders and include that in the process of climate governance is obviously quite tricky. These are some examples of where we use alternative fuels. Currently in Malaysia, there's quite a large selection of agricultural waste as well as industrial waste. There's also hazardous waste which can be used, but the co-processing is also a very good use of cement kilns in terms of making sure that they reduce environmental biodiversity conservation impacts. And of course, by reducing your Portland cement proportion, you obviously reduce your carbon footprint. So traditionally 1 ton of cement would have produced 1 ton of CO2. We've reduced that to, well, we've reduced it by about 30% by using fly ash, ground granulated blast furnace slag, copper slag, and other aggregates which go into the concrete production. So that's a very, very important part of the the mitigation of the calcination process emissions, which, as I say, are very hard to abate because that's a chemical process. Waste heat recovery. So one never thinks so much about heat as a waste product, but it's an incredibly valuable waste product in cement production. And you can achieve roughly 8, 9, or 10 megawatts of energy just from harnessing that heat. Again, dealing with multi-stakeholders in that process. But one of the areas that you alluded to, which was very important in this process of talking about climate governance, is biodiversity. So protecting the Kantan spider, the trapdoor spider, the snails, however small the animals are, they're equally important. So a snail measuring 1/10 of an inch is as important as a bat or a fruit bat that nests in the limestone caves, as are flora and fauna species of any size in karst outcrops. And interestingly, the more isolated an outcrop, the more endemic species of flora and fauna that you'll find there. So this is an incredibly important part of our work, preserving the outcrops that are of high conservation value. And this is where the board has made decisions on these matters. And this is where I think it's very important that we have the climate governance structure in place to ensure that those issues get cascaded down as well as upwards. But that gives you a little bit of an overview of where we are and where we intend to go. Thank you, Datin Sri.
Very good. Thank you so much, Ralph, for simplifying what could have been a very complicated topic. And now, speaking of complicated, I've left the most complicated business to last, Mr. Yi, President Group CEO of MISC, one of the largest LNG shippers in the world. Your business strategy is inextricably linked to the value chain, which is triggered when a customer such as Tokyo Gas commits to a long-term contract. Of course, I understand MISC has signed up to IMO's GHG reduction strategy and also Getting to Zero coalition, which is closely aligned to IMO as well. But the majority of energy consumption comes from the combustion of fuels for your vessels. So you're not just transporting LNG, you're fueled by fossil fuels. Your customers are predominantly in the fossil fuel industry. And to added complication, independent agencies like the IEA are calling for a halt in the development of new fossil fuels. Your competitors are starting to ship entirely carbon offset cargo. IMF and G20 are recognizing carbon pricing as an essential climate tool. How is the board of MISC actively implementing the principles of climate governance to ensure the organization is building resilience in the face of these huge climate risks? Over to you, Mr. Yi.
Thanks, Datin. I could feel the weight of the whole topic on my shoulders right now. But I think it's also good that I'm coming after Ralph, because I'm going to build on some of the things that he has said. So let me just set a context about what I'm going to share. Heavy duty shipping or heavy duty transportation, which is very energy intensive, or heavy industries like cement or even mining, I think we all know them as hard to abate global sectors. And MISC being a global shipping company, I hope what I'm going to share would help the audience understand how to get onto this journey of decarbonization and what are the levers you need to pull to try and transition towards a net zero carbon future. So I'll break it up into 4 parts. I think the 4 parts is, number 1 is recognize the need to change. And for us at MISC, from the board all the way down, it's about 2 sub-principles. 1, which is philosophical. Second, the need to survive. First one, philosophical. We believe that one of our mantra, the culture that we have here, is to try and improve ourselves every day, to try and find that 1 little centimeter, inch of things to improve every day, right? So we believe that we should be in a continuous state of improvement. We don't have a mantra of being the biggest in budgets. Our mantra is about find that 1 small millimeter of improvement and go for it. And because of that, it translates into this philosophy of we want to leave this planet in a better place than we found them. Or within MISC, we want to leave the organization to the next generation of leaders, directors, and employees in a better state, and let them build off it. Hence why we definitely need to be part of this whole transition. Second thing is more to do with, we need to do this to survive. And I think, as you said it earlier, we have 2 threats to our business model because of the need to get to net zero. Number one, as I said, we rely heavily on fossil fuel to power the assets, and there's a need to decarbonize. We need to switch to low emission vessels. Number two, MISC as a group, we are heavily focused on the oil and gas supply chain. Our clients, the entire oil and gas supply chain is also going through a massive paradigm shift, as all of us in the whole oil and gas supply chain needs to transition towards the net zero carbon era. So if we keep on doing things the way they are, our own survival come 2050 is at risk. So we have to change. Number two, pathways towards making these changes. And for us in the global shipping industry, because you are very technically and engineering focused, is obviously around two things. Number one, finding the technology that we can invest in that allow us to move towards a net zero carbon future. And in this, there are two subsets. One, moving towards a zero emission fuel, things like ammonia, things even like hydrogen fuel cells. And the technology is actually being worked on right now, being developed fairly rapidly. There are also what we call GHG removal technology, like removing carbon dioxide from the emission, removing SOx, NOx, methane. The technology will mature in this decade, which brings me to the second point. Is it financially feasible for the industry players to adopt them? So one is the availability of the technology. Second, it has to be feasible, because if it's too cost prohibitive, it will be a struggle. Third point is the need to move together. And what I mean by this is that I think not just the ship owners, which comprises the private sector, the public sector has moved together with it as well. And the public sector, we are referring to the regulators. I think it's no secret that IMO target come 2030 is not quite in sync with the Paris Accord, the targets, right? In fact, the private sector is calling for the public sector, and it's going to be a topic come COP26 in about 2-3 weeks' time, for IMO to step up, and the private sector is prepared to support a much more aggressive target to try and decarbonize. And for us working in the peer-to-peer within the private sector, I mean, MISC, we are a proud partner to the Global Maritime Forum, and Global Maritime Forum is a proud partner to the Getting Zero Coalition, which is between GMF, Getting Zero, World Economic Forum, Friends of the Ocean Action. And we've been working and connecting with a lot of peers in the entire supply chain. And because of that, it has allowed MISC to give birth to a few global partners to a project called the Castor Initiative. The Castor Initiative has one goal: to make a zero emission vessel powered by ammonia a reality by 2025. And this global coalition began with 6 partners. We soon have a 7th partner. We have MISC as a ship owner. We've got a leading shipyard to build the ship. We've got a leading engine maker. We have a leading Plus Society. We have a leading ammonia producer. We have a leading port authority, and eventually we have a leading port operator, right? So we've got a very complete ecosystem, and we do want to make a zero emission fuel a reality, right? Come 2025. So this is a case of moving together, and this is really peer-to-peer collaboration within the private sector. And lastly, I think they need to educate the masses, and this means both internal and external. The board, down to the last employee, the most employee, must understand what is sustainability. Why do we need to decarbonize? It's not a set of regulation. It has to be part of our culture, part of the way how we live, right? So everyone embraces it. There's also the need to educate external stakeholders, exactly what all the speakers have said, from investors, capital providers, our customers, because our emission, which is scope 1, scope 2, become their scope 3. There's no going away from this. So again, we need to communicate, educate everybody else what we're doing, so that we all can, I guess, cross the fishing line together, hands together. So I think that's how we journey, how we prepare ourselves for the next 30 years towards moving towards net zero carbon come 2050. Back to you, Datin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yee. Really appreciated your response. So I have a few questions now for the panel while we're waiting for the audience to send their questions in. So the first question, which I'd like to hear from each one of you, a classic example of a market failure is where damage caused by carbon emissions is borne by society at large, but polluters reap the profits and they're not liable for consequences in the main. So an important part of aligning behaviors is to put a price on carbon, which is already being implemented around the world. Of course, this is a complex mechanism, but I would like to ask the panel, what are your initial thoughts? How could such a pricing mechanism be implemented in Malaysia? And is your business and industry ready for this?
Well, maybe Datin Sri, if I may, take on that first. So obviously, the government has already announced the plan to look at establishing both the voluntary carbon market as well as the domestic emission trading scheme. And we are fortunate that the Bursa Malaysia has been mandated with that task, working together with CASA, KETSA, as well as the Ministry of Finance. So we had a number of engagements. We're now drawing up all the necessary rules and the mechanisms being put in place. But there's a lot more work to be done, I would say. So I guess the idea would be to make sure that we price carbon appropriately. There are various benchmarks currently available around the world. So it varies from as low as $5 to as high as $50 per ton of carbon equivalent. So the good thing is that we are getting all the infrastructure ready to be able to actually price carbon appropriately, so that those polluters will have to. So the idea would be for them to reduce pollution in the first place, and those that they can't reduce or manage, then they look at the offset mechanisms, if I may. Thank you.
If I may just jump in as well, because carbon levy and carbon tax is also a big topic within the global shipping industry, and I believe it will also be a topic that will come up during COP26. Shipping tax is like tax 101, right? It's basic economics, and tax is a tool that policymakers use to try and reallocate economic resources or to try and change socio-economic behavior. And it's perhaps what we need, at least for the global shipping industry, or even the hard-to-abate industry, whereby there's a tax imposed on emission. But the key thing here is, what do you do with the tax collection? It's almost like a stick and carrot approach, right? So tax the polluter, but if the proceeds can be channeled back into, again, the example of developing the right technology, right? Whether it's a zero emission fuel or whether it is carbon removal technology, or even as an incentive for players to adopt and jump onto or get into the bandwagon towards decarbonization, then I think it's going to be a very effective tool. And in the global shipping space, there's no need for a global regime. I mean, we've seen whereby when there was certain emission control area that came up, EU came up with it, the US came up with it later on. And we see possibly that the carbon levy, carbon tax will come up by regional blocks, and eventually you might reach a point of homogeneity, and then it becomes a global mechanism. So I think that's going to be something that, at least for the global shipping industry, we welcome it, we prepared for it. The key thing here is make sure that the proceeds are put to productive use. Thank you.
Datin Sri, maybe I could just jump in. I think Tan Sri and Mr. have covered the ground very well. Obviously, being active in the carbon markets means that as we assist companies to register projects and we trade carbon credits and also RECs, I naturally believe in the system of carbon offsets and RECs. I know that some NGOs recently have been making some suggestions that the systems are flawed, but I think the mechanisms are there, the schemes are working quite well, and we can see from carbon pricing that definitely these are incentives and disincentives to both producing and emitting, and also to offsetting. I think, as Mr. Yee said, what's very important is that the carbon taxes, if they're levied, are geared towards funding R&D, infrastructure development, the use of technology, so to ensure orderly transition from heavy, carbon-intensive industries to less intensive industries, so that we know that certain fossil fuels have obviously much higher emission factors than the renewable energies forms, but we also realize that the transition is very difficult and costly. So I think it's important that the carbon taxes or the carbon offsets, the funds are used in this way, that they can fund this very orderly transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Atin. I'll chip in as from advising a few of the corporates. I think the challenge now is we don't have a centralized emissions repository system. And I think this is something that we feed back to the policymakers. And it shouldn't be just covering the listed companies. It should cover all organizations, so that it's clear if all organizations, regardless of size, report on their scope 1 and scope 2, essentially all organizations could calculate their scope 3 emissions, similar to what Mr. Yee has mentioned. So I think without that clear transparency of emissions by all organizations, regardless of size, we won't be able to move the needle and get towards either emission trading schemes or carbon tax schemes. That's foundation number 1. This is based on our experience supporting one of the government to roll out their carbon tax in the region. The other part is a supply and demand. When it comes to coming up with the mechanism of, for example, before coming up with emission trading schemes, there is also discussion of having the carbon credit trading mechanisms, having that availability of systems to allow offset mechanisms. Are there very clear platform, rules and guidelines for offset mechanisms? Now, those are the steps that needs to be in place to drive towards a coordinated emission trading schemes or carbon tax. And I think this all need to happen within the short span of 2 years before the cross-border adjustment mechanisms by the EU comes into place by end 2023. We don't have much time because these are things that we have to ready ourselves. One thing to note is Singapore has already readied themselves with the carbon tax in 2019. So in short, we are not ahead in this region. We need to really ramp up and step up. And one way we could do it is to ensure that we are able to have a centralized emission reporting mechanism. This is similar to what Australia have. In our engagement with the Australian team, the government made it available for all emissions. All the banks could calculate their emissions of their portfolio lending. All companies could calculate emissions of their scope 3 in the supply chain. Now we need that kind of mechanism in place fairly quickly. And it has to be transparent and made available so everyone move the needle in a coordinated manner. Yesterday, we have just launched a thought leader having outlined the expectations for budget 2022. Within there, we've also outlined the challenges, which is, yes, Malaysia does have the green investment tax incentives, GITA and GITE. But again, recognizing that decarbonization is a strategy, like what Mr. Yee said, the technologies requires a very targeted coordination of tax incentives. So a general tax incentive that doesn't have a clear timeline to ensure the incubation or transition will not work. There are activities that we hope the government will expand and consider, which are the carbon capture technologies, plastic and sustainable packaging, sustainability services, and the development of talent pool in green technology skills. These are what we've put out as the recommendation. Now, why this is important? In some of the decarbonization strategy that we've done for large energy companies, the people still need to pivot. Otherwise, it will not only be stranded assets, we will have stranded talents in Malaysia. Now, other regulations or other governments have already come up with, like Canada, they've already come up with tax incentives specific on carbon capture technologies, recognizing that you need time to incubate. And there will be key transition players that requires that kind of incentives. targeted. Other countries have also came up with tax incentives that will help SMEs and corporates to reshape their business model, considering the need to pivot the transition. So government are providing them incentives to get someone to help them to relook at their business model. These are two use cases I wanted to highlight because it's very important for us all to understand that we need this mechanism in a coordinated manner. The faster we are and the targeted we are, the better we are positioned, all the companies in ASEAN.
Absolutely. Excellent. Thank you so much, Arina. I have one last question before I'm going to invite you to give your concluding remarks. And this is really about planetary boundaries, because we've had a lot of discussion about GHG emissions, but this is only one of the 12 important planetary boundaries which we are transgressing, causing this existential crisis. Other boundaries include fresh water, biodiversity, the chemical pollution. Now, each one of us operates within our spheres of influence, and each one of you is especially influential, not just within your own sphere, but multiple other spheres. So how are you working towards reducing environmental impacts within your own business, your customers or clients, in the industry that you operate in? I'd like to invite the panel to share your thoughts.
Definitely, if I may, let me just jump in because I think it's a topic close to my heart. I think it's important, again, part of the education, the energy transition, the need to get to net zero carbon is not the sole goal here, because it is a subset to this concept of the circular economy, right? Which has other things like biodiversity loss and waste management. Sometimes when we get preoccupied with decarbonization, we forget about the other two pillars, right? I think Ralph talked about as well as biodiversity conservation. So I think it's important that when we adopt and get onto a strategy for net zero carbon, do not forget having a strategy built around biodiversity preservation, conservation, and also waste management. And for us, we don't just look at just the technology around removing carbon and GHG. We've built a long-term strategy called MISC 2050, and it's all anchored around building a circular economy and how do we continue to exist and be relevant as a shipping company in a circular economy come 2050. And obviously there are lots to do. We've taken baby steps. We've done work, again, concept of working together. We're doing work with Reef Check Malaysia to try and preserve reefs around the coast of Malaysia. We're also doing work with universities for turtle conservation, preservation of the East Coast. And we soon will be embarking on a mangrove forest reforestation preservation. And that's critical. Besides biodiversity, mangrove forest is also a very important sequestration source of removing carbon, GHG, from the air. So again, key message here is don't think about just emission, think about biodiversity loss, waste management, and start with baby steps.
Sorry, the Chancery.
Sorry, the Chancery, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, sorry. If I may, obviously for us at the exchange, we are not that intensive from our own operations. Our scope one is actually pretty limited. But where we make the difference would be in operationalizing the policy as per the mission code on corporate governance, as produced by the SC. We then operationalize it to all the other public listed companies, being the frontline regulator. But beyond the exchange operation, so wearing my other hat as the trustee of WWF Malaysia, we're actually investing a fair bit of time and effort and money too, I suppose, in doing a study together with BCG in look at the whole landscape for Malaysia. So we're very clear about where the source of emissions are coming from, to what extent our nature-based assets, our forests are able to sequester and absorb a big amount of the carbon from the system, such that net we produce only, we have to deal with about 75 million tons of carbon equivalent, if I may. And from there, we then looked at how much investments will be required and in which particular area. And in our preliminary assessment, which we hope to conclude in 3 weeks' time at COP26, we will require, or Malaysia rather, will require investments of about 0.8% of our GDP. So that means about 12 to 15 billion ringgit of investments per annum. And I think this is where, when you have the mechanism, whether it's actually voluntary carbon market or domestic emission trading scheme, you will actually have that funding being made available together with all the tax incentives as mentioned for companies to actually invest in, whether in the nature-based solutions or in the CCUS technology, if I may. So I think the good thing is that we have a clear idea about what needs to be done, how much will it cost and so on. And I think once the report is ready, we'll then be able to showcase to everyone and let it be used by everyone. Of course, it's not perfect. I'm sure it'll be improvement, but the good thing is actually that's a starting point for us to look at all the various possible pathways towards achieving net zero. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Datin Sri, just quickly to pick up on the trail. We're very strongly in favor of working with regulators and policymakers, as you know from our history with combined cycle gas in Malaysia, with the introduction of alternative materials, aggregates, and fuels in the cement industry, and working, of course, with supply chains, customers as well as suppliers. But more importantly, in terms of implementing, I think Mr. Yee touched on a couple of things which were close to our heart as well. Mangroves, we planted 200,000 trees along the coast of the Paiton power plant in Indonesia. We've released 77,000 turtle eggs in the east coast of Malaysia with Lang Tengah Turtle Watch. So we also work with people like Reef Check Malaysia. There's an incredible amount of people, even Global Environment Council, very experienced experts in these areas. So critical to both have the policymakers, regulators, and then the engagement with the experts to implement, because we don't know enough about these areas to actually implement the projects ourselves, but we can certainly facilitate. So in terms of protecting the environmental impacts, I think extremely important to have these multi-stakeholder engagements. Thank you.
Thanks, Datin. I'll cover 3 key sectors. So EY has reached carbon neutral last year, and last Friday we have just achieved carbon negative. And we are way onwards on our SBTi targets to reach net zero by 2025. So we have walked the talk along the last year to this year. So I think that's one. And critically, because we are very much close to science-based targets, we have also, over the past 1-2 years, have supported leaders in sectors to come up with carbon neutral commitment, one in the property and construction sector, to actually set a carbon neutral target by 2040, and now working on their embodied carbon. So they will be reaching out to the likes of YTL to get emissions from their cement and supplies. That's the property and construction. For the ASEAN, one of the large utility group, we have helped them recently on a decarbonization strategy. And where we see it's important in setting the net zero target by 2050 is to have very clear decadal milestones. We don't believe in setting targets by 2050 without clear milestones in between, because investors are going to see where your capital funding are going to be focused on next. So they are going to go down to the next granular detail to see where are you pivoting your business to drive resilience. So part of that exercise was really to look at how the decarbonization strategy is, coupled with the research on internal carbon pricing, as well as their assets portfolio and generation mix. So these are things we've done for the utility sector. The third sector is the banking sector. Within the region, we have worked with a few organizations. I would say in Australia, the leading banks have started with Scope 3 emissions way before us. So within the region, we are working with 2 large organizations on their Scope 3 emissions. Now, we can't wait a lot of these large organizations know that in order to build a resilient strategy, they need to now understand where the emissions and the issues are. So I think we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I want to take this opportunity to share that no one should be waiting unless you want to be, eventually be obsolete or removed from the value chain or the ecosystem. So these are the focus areas that I think it's quite clear, regardless of sector, the leaders have moved already.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arina. Well, I want to thank each one of you. This has been such a great, insightful section. I am mindful that we've already overrun on time. So I'd now like to invite each of you to please share your concluding remarks with us. What do you want to leave the audience with?
Okay. I was hoping somebody else would take the lead. I think with all the noise we're hearing at the moment in the lead up to COP26, it can be a little bit overwhelming. And we want to avoid anxiety or fear and doom and despair. And I think we know what the causes are. So just as we have identified in our group, we know what is causing and what needs to be dealt with. So I think that's very important, is not to sink into this feeling of despair, but actually to have hope and optimism. I recently heard this program on BBC World Service, a guy called David Benatar in the University of Cape Town. He promotes something called antinatalism. And I was horrified to think that this was actually a movement to urge people not to procreate. I think that's the wrong approach. We must be far more optimistic. We must know that what we've identified through science are the causes. We have to deal with the causes in order to abate or mitigate the symptoms or the impacts. And I think an analogy I'd just like to end with is the Japanese art of ceramic repair called kintsugi, which is when you repair a broken bowl or ceramic object with gold and lacquer. So the analogy here is that we embrace our flaws and our imperfections, and we deal with them. We recognize what is wrong, but we adapt and we adjust. Thank you very much.
Let me just go next. Again, just to address the list of questions that are coming in, I think there's a lot of questions about companies just talking the talk, but not walking the talk. I think we need to walk the talk. It starts from the most senior person to the most junior person. All of us can be ambassadors when it comes to sustainability, all right, and trying to promote the circular economy. So I'll leave it with just two best way to describe how to walk the talk. Two African proverbs. I like to use this when I'm talking about sustainability. Number one, it's how do you eat an elephant? You eat it in chunks. What does it mean? To solve the energy transition, this whole circular economy, it's such a big problem. Like I said, start in small steps. Know your levels, know the different parts, start in baby steps, and eventually you will digest the whole elephant, right? That's the way to solve this. Number two is, if you want to run fast, you run alone. But if you're going to run very far for a long time, run together. And I think we need to work together when it comes to this energy transition and the goal to net zero carbon. We need to work together. I think we all need to join hands to cross the finishing line here. Thank you.
I think I'll go next before Tan Sri, because Tan Sri is the wisest among all of, I would say. So I think for, riding on Mr. Yee and Mr. Ralph, I think where I would say is there will be a need to actually cross-collaborate, but strategically from all diversity. Diversity is going to be the key strength for any businesses in moving the needle. And why this is important is the more you can come up with an equation of 1 + 1 = 11 or more, that is where you will pivot the strategy faster. One example would be digitalization. If we can actually drive digitalization, we can solve a lot of issues. Similar to how we want to solve human rights issue or wage labor issues, digitalization can help to resolve that kind of issue if it's very targeted. So these are things where we need to embrace change, but have diversity of thoughts, not from just, from an age, gender, but also from diverse skill sets and professional. We need to bring the engineers, the health and safety officers, we need to bring the accountants, we need to bring the scientists all together to drive that 1 + 1 = 11 solutions. So that is, and the last but not least is we only have one lifetime. I would urge everyone who's on the call to make the best of your one lifetime to make a difference.
Thank you, Arina. You mentioned me being the wisest. Probably you're referring to me to being the oldest, I suppose. Anyway, now, if I may, that is Sunita, this global movement towards net zero is real. A lot of things will be happening at COP26. I'm just glad that Malaysia will be there, in the sense that there'll be at least 130 countries that will state their commitments to net zero by either 2050 or 60. The fact that our Prime Minister had already made the announcement when tabling the 12th Malaysia Plan, I think is great. At least we are actually at the table, so to speak. And what needs to be done will be the rest will have to follow, both at the corporate level and at the individual level. At the corporate level, many of us are still learning, and naturally, there'll be a lot of guidance that we issued, and we all must realize that to achieve net zero will necessitate a multifaceted approach and commitments from everyone, all stakeholders. And there are numerous challenges that we must address, and if we are to raise our national climate ambitions. And therefore, it's very important for all of us to work together and focus not only on the challenges, but also on the building blocks to ensure that we can succeed. Now, beyond the corporate level, you go down to the individual level. So what we individually can do as a person, as a family, as a household. And that must surely start with how we deal with our waste, reduce it, segregate it, and deal with it properly. And if you have some rooftops, go out there and install your solar panel. To do what we can within our circle of influence to make all these small steps to contribute towards the bigger number that's needed to achieve the net zero target. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tan Sri Wahid. As you mentioned earlier, and here I'm going to be paraphrasing, at some stage, businesses that are not on this sustainability journey will find that investors are not willing to invest in them, bankers don't want to lend them money, customers don't want to buy their products, and people don't want to work for them. So we are faced with an opportunity, not just our lifetime, not just our generation, but in all likelihood, as the last generation who can change the trajectory the world is currently on. And so as individuals working in businesses, within industries and in society, we need to demonstrate that we can be a force for good. And I want to thank each one of you, Tan Sri Wahid, Mr. Yee, Ralph, Arina. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your insights. This has been a very stimulating session. Thank you, and see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Datin Sri Sunita, Tan Sri Wahid, Ms. Arina Kok, Mr. Ralph Dixon, and Mr. Yi Yang Chen for the excellent forum session. That brings us to the end of our Day 2 forum on how climate governance is shaping corporations today. But before we close, I would like to encourage you to complete our feedback form, which is on the chat box. Your views are important to us. I would also like to highlight tomorrow's session, which will feature a webinar on accelerating transition into sustainable energy. Our speakers for tomorrow will be Datuk Fazlur Rahman bin Zainuddin, Chief Strategy and Ventures Officer of TNB, Datuk Shairil Nazri Ahmad, Chief Operating Officer of Energy of Ibmuda Berhad, T.S. Sharifah Zaida Nulisha, President of Malaysia Oil and Gas Services Council, MOGSC, and Mr. Luke Joseph, Head of Country of BP Malaysia. This session will be moderated by Mr. Richard Spencer, Director of Sustainability at ICAEW. In addition, we would like to invite organizations to sign up for the BMCC Climate Action Pledge. The pledge will be launched with the support from British High Commission and UNGC. For organizations that have not started your climate action journey, it is a small step forward and let us guide you systematically towards fulfilling your climate action goals. A small step can lead to big changes. For organizations that are already taking climate action initiatives, join us to be an industry advocate and influence more organizations to take action to combat climate action change. Please support the pledge. For more information on the pledge, as well as all the webinars for the week, visit climateactionweek.bmcc.org.my. With that, thank you once again to all speakers and participants. Our appreciation also to our climate action partner and sponsor and supporting partners for assisting us to promote the webinar to their network. That brings us to a close of day 2 of Malaysia Climate Action Week. Thank you once again for joining us. Hope you found the session insightful. Have a great evening, and we look forward to for you to join us tomorrow. Thank you.